50 years ago today, the first matches were completed in the inaugural Cricket World Cup. And that was the 1973 tournament, taking place 2 years before there was ever a first men's event. And the games played that day included England beating an international 11 by 135 runs at Hove, Australia beating Young England by 7 wickets at Dean Park, Bournemouth, that was in Bournemouth, and New Zealand bowling out Trinidad and Tobago for 61 at Clarence Park in St Albans. Now, that World Cup was the brainchild of businessman Sir Jack Hayward and the legendary former England captain Rachel Hayhoe Flint. Sadly, Rachel passed away back in 2017, but 10 years ago, on the 40th anniversary, I spoke to her about how that tournament back in 1973 came about.
Well, I always actually blame it on a bottle of brandy because... the
best things often are, aren't they?
Well, that's right. I don't know if that was the right decision or not, but... in 1970, I'd written to Jack Hayward, who was Wolverhampton-born, Bahamas-based businessman, who was known to help eccentric projects and things that were good to do with Great Britain and England, United Kingdom. And he's known as Union Jack, and he brought SS Great Britain back from the Falkland Islands to Bristol, turned it into a maritime museum. He was born in Wolverhampton, so I just dropped him a note and I said, it was in the days before, quick communication. I had to write a letter physically. Bahamas-based, that's where his successful businesses are. Would he like to sponsor the England women's cricket team on a tour to the West Indies? This was in 1970-71. And damn me, I couldn't believe it. He actually rang me about 3 weeks later and said, I've got your letter here. I'll sponsor the England women's cricket team. And I thought, this is crazy, because ever since I'd been captain, which happened in 1966, I just resented the fact that there was so little profile, as we would call it nowadays, of women playing cricket, an international women's team playing. And so I thought, well, the only way to do this is to get sponsorship. But it's a sort of a vicious circle. If you're not known in the media, sponsors aren't interested. And then, well, how do you get interested? Because you can't have series of cricket matches without the money, because we're a very amateur organisation. So for Sir Jack, he was only plain Jack when I first wrote to him, so look what we did for him. For him to sponsor those 2 tours, we then became great friends, had a match down in, was it Hove or Hastings, down in Sussex, and I was staying with his family in Sussex. After supper, Jack and I sort of thought we'd try a little bit brandy, and there we were, working our way through this wonderful bottle of Hine brandy, and he eventually said, you know what we ought to do? We ought to have a World Cup of women's cricket, have another drink. And I thought, yes, that's a great idea, but who's going to pay for it? He said, I'll sponsor it. And that really was the seed of an idea. And I said, well, you'll have to get official sanction. Next day, the last day of our match, down in, I can't remember if it was I think it was Hastings. Jack went to speak to Sylvia Swinburne, chairman of the Women's Cricket Association, said, I've got this idea, let's go for it. It'll put women's cricket on the map. So 1973, lo and behold, it took place and it happened.
So it took a fair amount of planning, but it was eventually held in England. And describe the teams which took part, because it drew quite heavily on the West Indies still, didn't it?
Yes, in those days, we'd created a lot of interest in the West Indies through our tours which Jack had sponsored. But it wasn't a West Indies team. They hadn't got together as many islands and representing the whole of the West Indies. So it was Trinidad and Tobago was the one team, Jamaica was the other team, and then we had Australia, New Zealand, and then to make up the numbers, we had a Young England 11, and then an international 11, which was a composite of representatives from all the other teams that were taking part. And it was done as a round-robin tournament, and that was the only problem, or it could have been a problem, But it did actually happen that the last match of the round-robin series was England against Australia at Edgbaston, and whoever won it would win the first World Cup. And afterwards you think, well, thank God, thank goodness that it was the two who were in to win it who came to that. Otherwise it would have been a rather bore a draw, wouldn't it, to have two teams that had no part in the ultimate destination of the World Cup.
So that felt pretty much like the final. I suppose it gets referred to as the World Cup final, doesn't it? And was attended presented by Princess Anne, no less.
Yes, it happened to coincide with the day that she was doing good deeds in Birmingham, and we were thrilled that she came along because I'd met her on one or two other sporting occasions, like the Daily Express Sportswomen of the Year Awards, and that was when she was very high profile in 3-day eventing, and so to be able to have her there, royal presence, again, it gave more credence to the event. There was a reasonable crowd. I would think probably about 4,000 turned up, mainly our relatives. And the trophy was a very handsome, because Jack sort of said, "Oh well, I'll pay for the trophy," and instead of having one of these conglomerate things, made from a trophy manufacturer, he took me to the Silver Vaults up in the City of London, and we chose a Georgian silver chalice that was beautifully designed, but I think it was actually something that people sold things onto the Silver Vaults there, and I think it was for an allotment competition or
really?
Something like
a second-hand trophy.
A second-hand trophy almost, but very high quality silver, I hasten to add.
Do you remember what media coverage you got during that World Cup back then?
I think leading up to the final match, it was just minimal, and it was at the stage where what we put into it, we would get out of it as far as media coverage was concerned. And I was very conscious of the fact, because I just about moved into journalism in those days, and I knew how one should create that interest. And all the nationals covered us, the serious nationals anyway, and there were some very glowing comments in the heavies as much as anything else. We did get some television coverage, which was put out as highlights the next weekend, I think on Grandstand or something like that, but not the sort of coverage that happens nowadays, because the Women's Cricket Association in those days was one paid official in a tiny office which we leased, or probably had it donated to us from the Sports Council in Brompton Road. So one paid official, but enormous number of volunteers in all the counties that played, and it was, a remarkable achievement to get it off the ground. We had the opening ceremony actually on Jack's birthday on June the 14th at Chiswick on the Civil Service Ground, so that all the teams could play on the various pitches, and it was opened by the then chairman of the Sports Council, Roger Bannister, no less. So it's probably the nearest he's ever come to playing international cricket, I would guess.
Well, that was the late Rachel Ho-Ho Flint speaking to me back in 2013, and goodness, where has the game got to since then? What a story that is, hearing about how the very first World Cup trophy even came about. Now, the leading run scorer in that inaugural World Cup was the irrepressible Enid Bakewell, who has been here at Trent Bridge watching this test match. She in fact rang the bell before play began yesterday on day one, so that was a tremendous honour for Enid, and being recognised in that way. She was also the player of the match in the victory over Australia that gave England that trophy 50 years ago. She made 118 and she took 2 for 28 from 12 overs. And I've been hearing Enid's memories of that first World Cup.
Well, it was all inspired by Rachel when she got together with Jack Hayward, of course. He was really inspirational, and he did inspire us. And we went here, there and everywhere over the country, and Rachel would take us just to let people know that women played cricket, which was so important in those days.
So that first ever World Cup, it featured teams such as, well, there was obviously an England team that you played in. There was a Young England,
yes,
an International 11.
Indeed.
2 teams from the West Indies, separate teams in Trinidad and Tobago and Jamaica. So what were your first memories of the first match that you played in?
I do remember travelling around, because of course I was working at the time. You had to work because I wasn't being paid.
And what was your job, remind us?
Well, I taught PE, but I used to teach swimming by this time because I'd got family down at the local school. So I'd got to concentrate on that. And so, of course, I used to put the children to bed, and then I'd do my training outside on the road, well, not on the road, on the pavement, where the cars were coming down, and I'd try and beat a car for 2 lampposts and then walk back.
So during that tournament, tell me about things like even what kit you wore. Did you have to buy and pay for your own kit, and where did that money come from?
We did. Well, we just had to work and earn it. in fact, we were still wearing shorts in those days, and you had to kneel down, and they measured how far up the shorts went from your knee. And if it wasn't the right length,
it's the sort of thing that they used to do in school. Goodness me. There's stories of, say, Rachel Hayhoe Flint going around the ground, rattling a bucket to ask people for donations. Was that happening during that tournament?
Well, I can't remember that, but in fact, Rachel was an absolute amazing woman, because she'd have to captain and have to concentrate all the time, whether we were batting or fielding. Then she would come out off, and I shared a room with her at that time. And so she'd ring up home to say that she was all right. Then she'd ring up and give a report of the match. Then, of course, she'd have a shower and change. And then she'd get the ukulele out and entertain us. And she said, it's not the cricket that tires me out. It's entertaining the troops afterwards. But we were as happy as sandboys. The only time she really hated it was when some of us weren't wearing spikes down at Exmouth, I think it was. And the umpires brought us off the pitch because they didn't think it was safe for us to play when we weren't playing in spikes. And we lost the game. And I've never known Rachel so quiet. And then I'm looking round and I'm thinking, where's Rachel? She's not in slip. She's not there. She's giving an interview under an umbrella, wasn't she, at the time? Yeah, so that was amazing.
Did the World Cup feel like an event? Did it feel different to the other internationals that you'd played? Had Rachel and Sir Jack managed to sort of whip up a degree of interest that it felt a little bit different to other matches?
It was different for us in that we got to go round virtually from one pitch to another. And I think at one stage I had to drop my husband off at Rolls-Royce at Hucknall, and I'd gone in my tracksuit on top of my bedclothes. And I got stopped by the police coming back to show them my driving licence. I said, I haven't got my driving licence. I've only just taken my husband to work, that's all. I'm taking. And then, of course, I had to go somewhere else. Unfortunately, I got my England blazer in the car so they could see that. But they asked me for my licence then. And I said, no, I'm playing cricket. I haven't brought my licence with me. So I had to produce that within 3 days. And I think at one stage...
This is on the way to a World Cup match?
Yes. And of course, I didn't join with others because I lived near Nottingham, so that went there.
So the tournament was set up as a round robin. Everyone played everyone, and hence why you're travelling around everywhere. What are your memories of the last game at Edgbaston? It commonly gets referred to as the World Cup final, but it was just the last game of the round robin, wasn't it? But it was England v Australia, and it was to determine who would win. It
was amazing because it was a 60-over game, and of course I had to go out with Lynn and bat. And I jokingly say, they used to say, we can't cope with your jokes, just go out there and stay out there. That's not true. But that was what we thought, that was what we got to do. We got to get as many runs as we could so that we could put the Aussies in. And so it was amazing. And the thing I do remember is that my father came and watched. And although he was a counsellor for years and years, he wasn't a sporting chap at all, but he used to wear this blanket over his arm because he was in his 80s by this time. And he came to watch, and he was a tremendous... of course, he looked after the children most of the time. He'd take them off either to the zoo or to watch something, so I could concentrate. I didn't have to worry about them dirtying the new clothes that I bought them.
And do you remember what happened after the match? England had won, and it was a World Cup. There'd never been a World Cup in men's cricket at this stage. So was there much media interest at that stage?
I can't remember any media interest. I do remember Princess Anne being there, and she was amazing. She really was. And the really tremendous atmosphere that we got, and thanking Jack Hayward for all the support he'd given us, because we would never have played that had it not been for him.
Did you actually meet Princess Anne yourself, personally?
Oh, yes. She gave us our medals and put them around our necks. And then, of course, I met her when I got the MBE. And, of course, she's talking to me about cricket, so I'm talking about the men. I don't mean the men, she said. I mean, talk about the women.
Can you quite believe when you come to the start of an Ashes series now and the World Cups that have taken place, the sellout at the MCG in 2020, where the game is? When you think back to that very first World Cup and when Rachel started that movement. Rachel
was the one who started the movement. She played the ukulele round Lords to let people know that people played cricket. And I got into trouble from Chris Watmiller, number 3 bat, and she said, why did you get yourself... I said, because Rachel's initiated this game. She needs to bat out here. She deserves to bat. She's done all the hard work towards it. Amazing woman, absolutely amazing woman.
And what about yourself, Enid? Remind us what age you are now, if I can ask. And are you still playing?
I'm 83 in December, but I'm still playing, yes. I don't bowl overarm now, though. I've worn my arms out, but I've got 2 new knees, so I can still run.
Do you have a sort of favourite player now, someone that you really admire in the current generation of cricketers?
No, they're all my favourites. I mean, Nat Sivert is absolutely brilliant, isn't she?
It's a very Len Goodman kind of thing to say. They're all your favourites. I love it. Enid, great to chat to you.
They are. They're amazing, aren't they? Because it's all a team.
Well, that was Enid Bakewell. What a character she is. She's been watching this test match here at Trent Bridge. A reminder that it's lunchtime here on day 2. Australia 439 for 8 with Annabelle Sutherland 116 not out. A maiden international 100 for her, and she's done it in this Ashes test match. We're talking about the 50th anniversary of the first matches being completed in the first ever Cricket World Cup. It was the Women's World Cup of 1973. And you can read a lot more about that first World Cup in an excellent article that is out today on the BBC Sport website. That's been written by Hannah Thompson-Radford. And someone who's written widely on the subject is the journalist, historian and senior lecturer in sport at Bournemouth University, Raf Nicholson, who is with me up in our commentary box, writing here for The Guardian as well. Raf, welcome to you.
Thanks for having me.
Now, 50 years ago today then, since those first matches were actually played, there was a game scheduled the day before that, wasn't there? A few days earlier, as we heard at Kew Green, but abandoned without ball being bowled. That was a bit of a fizzer to start the World Cup.
Yeah, it was Jamaica v New Zealand, as you say, at Kew Green, and very disappointing for everyone that it didn't manage to get underway as scheduled. It's funny because you read actually about that 1973 summer as being a very hot first few weeks, and then the first ever Cricket World Cup starts and it rains.
Very typically English.
Yes.
When you look at the teams that were involved then, and we heard there about the 7 teams, it included an international 11, Young England, Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago. I mean, how strong were those teams and relative to each other?
Well, I think what we have to remember is that these were actually the first ever one-day internationals played in women's cricket. So none of the teams really had any experience of this format. Now, England were quite canny, and they realised that this was coming and it was going to be quite a big deal, so they spent a couple of years actually having some domestic matches. So they were played over 60 overs, so they had some kind of domestic matches played in this format, so they kind of were getting to grips with it. But for teams like Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago, it's the first ever official internationals that they ever played, so obviously they were going to perhaps struggle a little bit.
And obviously before that there was a combined West Indies women's team.
Yeah, precisely. The other one that we might perhaps be thinking, where's India? They did not have an international kind of association until 1973, and actually at the last minute they wrote to the Women's Cricket Association, who were running it, and said, please can we join in? And the WCA said, unfortunately we've already put all the arrangements in place, but why don't you come to our meeting of the International Women's Cricket Council? And then so India were then able to play in the second Women's World Cup, which was actually hosted by India in 1978.
And there was no South Africa either because of the political situation and apartheid of the time. Exactly,
and actually the International 11 was partly conceived as a way of trying to incorporate South Africa into the tournament, a little bit kind of via the back door. So the idea was that if you had an International 11, they would then invite 5 South African players to compete in that, and because they weren't competing under the South African label, you could kind of get away with it. Obviously, when the Jamaican and the Trinidadian governments found out about that, they weren't massively happy, threatened to withdraw both their teams, which would have made the whole tournament unviable. So the WCA had to slightly back down on that. So the International 11 then ended up just being kind of some players from all of the other teams combined.
Sport and politics, never far away from mixing. What about the grounds that all these matches were played at? And we heard of a couple, obviously, Kew Green, but then Edgbaston. What about the other venues? Because it was up and down the country.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's a very kind of eclectic bunch of venues if you look at it. So you mentioned Dean Park in Bournemouth, and the idea was, I think, to try and take women's cricket around the country to lots of different places where it had never been played before, to try and kind of spread the women's cricket gospel, as it were. And obviously the other kind of barrier was that some of the men's counties at that time would still have had, perhaps slightly negative perceptions towards women's cricket. So the only first-class grounds, or the only kind of main first-class grounds where they did play were Hove, and obviously the final was staged at Edgbaston. They did want to play the final at Lords, by the way. They wrote to the MCC and said, please can we play the first ever Cricket World Cup final at Lords, and the MCC said no.
Just a flat no.
Yeah, very politely, but it was a no.
Well, it took a while then, didn't it? For obviously then, I mean, there's other anniversaries that we'll talk of, aren't there? Because 25 years, isn't it, since Women Members, 1998, 25 years since the Ashes Trophy was created as well, which is veering onto another subject. We'll bring it back to the World Cup. I mean, 1973, there hadn't been any men's World Cup. That took place in 1975, but I don't know, it makes you wonder sort of why the idea hadn't been thought of before even.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. So actually, the Australian women had suggested in 1966, at a meeting of the International Women's Cricket Council, shall we play some kind of international tournament? And the WCA said, well, that's very nice if you can arrange it, but we won't be able to take part because we haven't got any money. So that's what you needed. You needed an injection of cash from somebody. And that's why Jack Hayward played such a crucial role. He actually, I think it was eventually £40,000 that he put towards staging it, which was an awful lot of money.
Yeah, back then.
Yeah, and so that was the kind of key thing, so it was this kind of this exciting idea that he actually came up with himself when he was just chatting to Rachel, saying, well, what can we do to try and raise the profile of women's cricket? And it was quite a kind of revolutionary idea, I think, because as you say, cricket had never had a World Cup. Many sports at that time had never had a World Cup, and I think actually it was a bit of a gamble, to be honest. It was a little bit of a kind of, well, we don't quite know how this is going to go or if this is going to work. So I think they were taking quite a big risk because it was a lot of money to put into something that even the men had never done.
You needed to have that person who was, I guess, willing to lose a lot of money, just willing to throw something at the thing that he was passionate about.
Exactly.
And it was really that link with Rachel that brought him into the women's game, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I just wonder, the media side of it, it seems extraordinary to think that Rachel Heyhoe-Flint was playing these matches. She was taking buckets around, collecting. We heard Enid talk about her playing her ukulele around the grounds, almost like a herald, if you like, telling people about the game, but also then being the person to literally take reports to the media and say, look, here is a sort of spoon-feeding the media. And to what degree did that all get picked up then?
Well, I think there was actually quite a lot of media coverage. I've looked, as part of my historical research, at kind of tracking the level of media coverage. And because it was this big event, this new event, they actually did get a reasonable amount of coverage, and they did get, reporters from newspapers like The Guardian, like The Times, actually turning up to the ground and reporting. And that was something that, it had been done a little bit before, but I think there was this kind of buzz around the tournament. And if you read the WCA's official report of the tournament, a sort of kind of review that they did, there's a great line in there about actually all of this media coverage and the quality of the cricket kind of convincing the doubting Thomases that women's cricket was something that people did want to engage with and were interested in. You just had to get them to the ground. And so I think that there was a kind of a new level of coverage. Now, the final wasn't actually televised live, but there was some highlights, and seeing women's cricket on the TV at that time was still extremely rare. So even having that highlights package broadcast in particular regions of the country was really exciting.
The one question which I never got to ask Rachel was, how did she get Princess Anne along to Edgbaston? Because everyone knows she was there, but there must be a story behind how you get a member of the royal family to come to this first ever World Cup. I say the final again, the concluding match that resulted in the trophy being awarded.
Yeah, it feels quite appropriate in a way, doesn't it? Because obviously a great kind of sportswoman herself, supporting this really exciting event. So it was definitely a coup for them. I'm not sure of the answer of how they managed to get her to do it.
And where are all these records of the WCA kept? Where's the kind of archive that you delve into when you're looking back over all these things?
So when I started doing my research looking at the history of women's cricket, it was actually in a cowshed in Lancashire. Very kind of...
Who's cowshed?
Well, it's a long story, but a former England player who actually played in the 1993 World Cup, Carol Hodges, as she was then. As she is now, she was Carol Cornthwaite. She had the WCA kind of archive boxes because she had room for them, but they have now been acquired by Lords, and they are now being safely stored in the library there. So that is a relief to all archivists who I ever tell this story to, that they are now safe.
And the actual Sir Jack Hayward trophy as well. What has happened to that? Because it obviously was replaced by a brand new World Cup trophy when the ICC took over the running of the game. And that was the first World Cup then was 2009, wasn't it, when that trophy was awarded for the first time. So what has happened to the Sir Jack Hayward trophy?
So I believe that's at Lords as well. They recently had a women's cricket exhibition, and it was on display there. So that is also safe, which is nice. It was lovely hearing that story about how they kind of acquired it
from the silver
second-hand.
vaults. Yeah. Extraordinary, isn't it?
Yeah.
I do remember Rachel saying that back then in 2013 that she would have loved if the Sir Jack Hayward trophy could be sort of re-awarded somehow, like still have a place for maybe it being the player of the tournament at a World Cup or such like. I don't know, those conversations are being had.
A women's Test Championship trophy, perhaps, Ali.
Well, there we go. That could be something for the future, isn't it? Not working to the future with a nod from the past. Another notable side of the 1973 World Cup, which I hadn't realised until looking into it, was that all the umpires were female. That's right.
Yeah, that is absolutely correct. Few people realise this, but the WCA had a policy that for all home internationals, they would only use female umpires. They did obviously have male umpires umpiring in women's cricket, but they couldn't achieve that kind of top elite level of umpiring in an international women's match that took place in England. So that was also the case for the 1973 World Cup. It was this really kind of almost like flagship policy. They were really keen to kind of give women those opportunities that they wouldn't have at that time got in men's cricket.
Yeah, and I suppose that's sort of now what we see as well, that the women's game is an excellent vehicle, male and female umpires, but it is a big vehicle for giving women their opportunities. And then we're seeing Sue Redfern progress into, say, men's cricket and others behind her as well. What of the reception in Downing Street is also something I haven't read an awful lot about, but the Prime Minister at the time was Sir Edward Heath.
Correct.
So what happened there? Because, we all know what happened in 2005 when the Ashes-winning men's and women's England teams were invited. What about the World Cup-winning team of 1973?
Well, I'm reliably informed by Rayleigh Thompson of Australia that there was a lot of scampi eaten.
Scampi, OK.
I'm guessing there was probably some alcohol on offer as well. But Rayleigh spent the entire reception chasing around after the scampi tray, apparently.
I can't believe it's scampi and not sort of smoked salmon or...
I know. Well, she obviously considered it a delicacy.
Yeah.
It was attended by an awful lot of very famous people, Ray Illingworth, Virginia Wade. It was a really exciting event, and Rachel actually presented Ted Heath with his own cricket bat as part of that reception. So, it's a great way of the government marking such an exciting event, and I suppose an indication of the kind of levels of coverage and awareness that there was of the tournament.
Are there many photographs of that reception?
I haven't seen any photographs of the reception. I think that Rayleigh actually sent me her invitation, a photo of her invitation, which she'd obviously kept and treasured over the years. So that was very exciting to see.
They're the sort of really fantastic archive pieces, aren't they, from those days? So the all-female umpiring side of it, and the players that featured in that early World Cup. And looking at the kind of the era and those who then played in subsequent World Cups as well. You look at the likes of, when you think of the Australian team, Sharon Tredrea, who, when you mention fast bowlers and who's the quickest or who's been the quickest in the world, a lot of people put their hand up and say, Catherine Fitzpatrick. But actually, you speak to the Aussie players, who will all say, no, Sharon Tredrea was quicker than Catherine Fitzpatrick. But of course, pre-speed guns, it is down to those who are of that era to judge.
Yeah, absolutely. Because we're talking of a very different era, aren't we? We're talking of an era when everyone's an amateur, and actually at that point it comes down to kind of enormous natural talent. And that's what's so nice about kind of looking back at some of these things and hearing Enid Bakewell talking about how amazing it was to be captained by Rachel Hayhoe-Flynn, and just this kind of amazing love for the game that they all had. And I think that was really the reason for having this World Cup, actually, was, we love women's cricket. We want more people to share that love with us. And we think that it deserves kind of appreciation. So we're going to take a bit of a gamble. We're going to have this huge tournament, and we're going to try and share it with people.
Does it feel remarkable somehow that it took another 25 years before the women's game then was taken under the umbrella of the England Wales Cricket Board and the ICC, later on again? I mean...
Yeah, I think the World Cup didn't transform women's cricket overnight. And I think that we saw that in 2017, actually, that even, England winning a World Cup at home, a Women's World Cup at home, does not necessarily kind of automatically translate into anything. It's a really exciting event in and of itself, and it can lead somewhere, but it doesn't necessarily do that automatically. There were lean years that followed that first World Cup. The 1980s were particularly bleak financially for the Women's Cricket Association. They were still really struggling to afford to host internationals, and there was a big question mark about, is there going to be a second Women's World Cup, because can we actually afford it? There was, took place in India in 1978, and now the women's international calendar, and indeed the men's international calendar, is unthinkable, unimaginable without the World Cup as kind of the centrepiece in multiple formats. It did obviously have a legacy, but it didn't necessarily mean, women's cricket can somehow automatically grow or become professional overnight. That all took time, and that took a lot longer to change attitudes, I think.
I mean, I remember the time when the ICC was taking over the running of the global women's game, and there being almost a little bit of sort of, not necessarily suspicion, but just a bit of reticence, and probably the same for the individual boards or organisations who are running women's cricket on an amateur basis in their countries, to be kind of swallowed up by the bigger organisation as a whole. So thinking, well, these organisations that run, the professional side of the game, they're running men's cricket. Are they actually going to care for our game in the same way? So that took a bit of a shift, or a bit of a leap of faith, didn't it, to almost sort of cede control of the women's game and say, OK, we're comfortable to give it to you, because we've just got to trust that you will do the right thing by it and you will grow it for us.
Well, in many ways forced into it financially because they didn't have any other alternative. A lot of the women's organisations were, as I say, struggling massively financially. There, of course, was this huge reluctance and these fears about being kind of taken over by men who didn't really know or understand women's cricket. And I think yes, there's been amazing stuff that's happened to women's cricket, but to some extent those fears have been borne out in some of the ways in which international women's cricket has been governed. We've seen a massive decline in women's Test cricket, and only recently being revived, for example. I think that some of those fears were potentially justified, and it's an interesting one. I do sometimes wonder if Rachel were here today, what she would make of everything.
Well, I know she would have been absolutely thrilled, wouldn't she? The 2017 World Cup final, which she passed away sadly prior to that incredible day at Lords, and
wouldn't have ever happened without her.
No, absolutely. Even speaking to Enid Bakewell yesterday, what I find so incredible about the former players is there's no sense of jealousy about what the current generation have. It's just a sense of, goodness, didn't we love the game and what we have helped to do, and recognising that. And I think it's wonderful when the current generation do dip into history, and it probably should happen more often than it does, to realise what has gone before. I think there is a generally fair amount of awareness of that in the women's game.